You know, those of us who have young children or have raised young children know how difficult waiting can be, at least in their life, right? I mean, I have 4 of them, and every year they have a birthday. And every year, when their birthday is finished, the first question is, a week or 2 down the road, what are we going to do next year for my birthday? They've already planned out the decorations. They know where the events will be. They already know what presents they want. They've got it all set on the calendar, and the invitations are being made. But they live in that kind of annual anguish, right? Day after day, waiting for my birthday. Mommy, is it my birthday yet? How many more days, Daddy, until my birthday? I said, well, we've got about 346 days left and counting. And it's that question. It happens time and again for my children. We have to remind them day after day that their last birthday was just a few weeks ago. They've got plenty of time. And then finally, the great day arrives, that day in infamy, right? When it's their birthday. And it's 6:30 a.m., they've already woken up and they're like, where's the party? They walk outside and they're, where are the kids at? When are they coming? They stand at the window. And you have to spend most of the day convincing them that, the party doesn't start until noon. That's at lunchtime, and they can get kind of restless. 7:30 already rolls around, and they are convinced that you don't love them, that this has all been a hoax, and that you've lied. There's no party, nothing but agony to happen. Christmas is another holiday where that same experience is relived time and again every year. Anticipation, that's the point. This kind of anticipation that happens every single year. Have you ever tried to put a kid to bed on Christmas Eve? I don't know if you've succeeded. I still haven't done it. You check on them at 1 in the morning. They're still there, awake, waiting for Christmas morning to come. And then Christmas morning arrives. Every year, my kids, they're there at the door waiting for the crack of dawn, standing there just waiting to know when they can come in and wake up Mommy and Daddy. And then after they open their gifts, they have breakfast. What's the next question? Well, what time are we going to Grandma's house? Because they know they get to relive that same experience again and again throughout the day. Where's the rest, they ask, Anticipation is difficult for children. I mean, man, teaching them to learn that one key word, wait. And it happens all throughout life, though. I tell this to my wife, it's amazing how God has given us children to really illustrate the struggles that we face all throughout life. Because as we teach them and we see ourselves in them in our past, we really still are a bunch of big kids, aren't we? I mean, even at 38 years old, I'm still a baby. Can you imagine? I mean, have you ever looked at yourself and you think, I'm getting older? Try looking at God. I mean, that eternal perspective. We're all a bunch of kids to Him. We live this experience out, I say. You think about marriage, and I don't know if this was something that you faced, but when I was young, marriage didn't look too hopeful. I was waiting and waiting and waiting. Year after year, I would go on a few dates at college, and then they wouldn't pick up their phone, and they weren't looking at me anymore, and I knew it wasn't meant to be. Christian men and women are, you get to the point where, they're just not around anymore, and you're still getting older. And now there seems to be the options are just, falling away. And will I ever find that special someone? Will I ever get married? Maybe you remember pushing hard in a career. You've worked hard time and again trying to get up that corporate ladder. Trying to get up to the top. Pushing and pushing and pushing. And yet it just seems that you're stuck at a dead end. There's no prospect of seeing any of your hopes realized. And yet time just keeps on going on. And I was going to say something about our new clock, and it's not working anymore. But I don't know if you saw our beautiful big clock on that screen. But time just keeps on going, doesn't it? And we can grow impatient. The Christian life is a lot like that. We read a verse last week in Genesis 15 where it said that we were justified by faith. we've accepted God's gift of righteousness by a simple act of trust. We know we possess it, not because of something we've done, but because of Jesus Christ. And we live every day by faith that God's promises will be realized. And yet as you get into the grime of it, you look at your life, and sometimes it's easy to struggle as you look for that fruit of love, joy, and peace, and all you see is emptiness and barrenness. It's easy to think that maybe we need to help God out a bit. You see phrases on the back of bumpers, where it says, God helps those who help themselves. You know how the saying goes, right? And we start believing that while God told me what he wants, now the rest is up to me. Maybe he has shown me the goal, but it's going to be up to me to figure out how to reach that goal. If you've ever thought like that, then you're not alone. Because as we approach Genesis 16 this morning, with Sarai and Abraham, we find this is exactly where they are in this part of the story. At the end of the last chapter, God had formalized his covenant that he made back in Genesis 12. He's ratified it with this oath, this ceremony in Genesis 15. But as you arrive at Genesis 16, the very first verse of this chapter, it restates an ongoing problem. The problem that despite God's promise, his numerous promises to Abraham and to Sarai, the truth is the nursery was still painfully empty. In verse 1 we read, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. This next verse here, as you read Sarah's words, you sense you get this sense of a frustration building in her heart. Verse 2 says, and Sarai said to Abram, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. And as you read these words, you almost wonder if maybe she sees barrenness as a kind of punishment. That's often what women think when they can't have a child. God is punishing me. And here you find a classic human attempt to solve a problem with man's wisdom and not God's. We get ourselves into so much trouble, don't we? When we try to solve our problems and help God, don't we? Have you ever thought, well, God obviously needs a hand, right? Obviously we can't do this alone. He can't do it alone. We come up with all sorts of plans to help God out. It all depends on me. Well, that's exactly what happens in this story here with Sarai and Abram. She sits down here and Sarai lays out all the options and she gets to work and she starts thinking. Time is passing here and the promises are not coming to pass. Nothing has happened. And again, we see a classic story of waiting on the promises of God. Sarai, I think she has a solution. She looks over to her Egyptian servant Hagar, and here in verse 2, so Sarai said to Abram, at the end of the verse it says, please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Now look, as we read this, I understand we don't like this. And I totally get why. There's a lot of questionable things going on in this text. A lot of morally questionable things here. But understand something. In the culture of the day, in this culture, this was an acceptable practice. It was a socially accepted custom. And so on paper, at least, it's a very plausible option here. As far as the culture goes, you see. And remember now, up to now, if you think of the promises that God's made to Abram, God has made these promises to him. But at this point, Sarai hasn't really come into the picture. He has restrained the promise to being of Sarai's seed at this point. And so it seems like a viable option. And so the idea seems reasonable, just as Satan's shortcuts always do. And what happens next, it echoes something that happened earlier in the book of Genesis. We're going to read these verses and see if you can pick up on it. Verse 2 says, and Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Verse 3, then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. If you recall, this is exactly how the giving of the fruit played out in the Garden of Eden back in Genesis 3. Listen to Genesis 3:17 as God is rebuking Adam here. He says this, that you, and his rebuke is that you have heeded the voice of your, of course, is referring to what had happened back in verse number 6 when Eve, it says, took the fruit and did eat and gave unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And you can really see as you lay these situations together how they are similar. They are a lot alike. And the truth is, I'm sure Sarai and Abram were both thinking that they were helping God out with this opportunity to solve these problems, to bring about God's promise. I'm sure they were both honestly motivated by an eager desire to see God's purposes fulfilled. And yet, as you read these verses, you recognize that she alone is offering this plan, and Abram alone is the one accepting it. God is entirely absent from this part of the story and from their planning. And there's already a hint that we suspect that they both have overstepped a boundary. Somehow we wonder if the life of faith should not have maybe taken a different path. But this was their choice. And you know what makes it even more difficult as you study the passage is that it actually works. I mean, look at the next verse here. The Hagar plan, in a sense, it succeeds, right? So he went to Hagar, and she conceived. Like Hagar, she's pregnant now, and she gets a chuckle. She looks over at Sarai. It's not too hard there, Sarai. You see, that's how it's done. And you can understand that when because it says here, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. There's a spring in Hagar's step now, a strut in the way she walks, a pride, a disdain in her eye. Her mistress was looked upon with contempt. She despised Sarai. She thought she was better than her now. I can imagine that attitude making Sarai sick, can't you? I mean, she's growing bitter. And this is really when things really just start to fall apart. Because now Sarai turns over to Abram. She lays into her husband here. The wrong inflicted on me, it's all your fault. Verse 5 says, Then Sarai said to Abram, My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. Sarai's plan is clearly falling apart, And finally, in her anger, she brings God into this. Isn't that incredible? God has been totally absent, but when it doesn't work, now God can have it. The Lord judge between you and me. In essence, may God himself intervene, and may he make you miserable, Abram. May he look down from heaven and make you just as miserable as I am right now. Someone's pretty mad. Someone's pretty angry. And you've got to give Abram some credit here. I mean, if you think about it, he's probably thinking, how do you figure this out? This was your idea, right? I was just obeying your orders. Wait a second. But the truth is, he was wrong too. Right? The way this is all playing, he went along with it. And he is just as guilty as she is. Just as eating the fruit applied to man and to woman, so husband and wife together, one flesh, had made a decision. And now they're bearing the consequences of that choice. If Abram wanted to stop this, it should have ended a long time ago. As soon as Sarah offered Hagar to him, Abram should have said, No, Sarah, that's not how this is going to go. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to on the promises of God. But you know what? After he had already agreed to this, after he had taken Hagar, to then do what he does in this next verse is even worse. Abram said to Sarai, Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. Abram should never have taken Hagar as a wife. But once he took her as his wife, to cast her out is even more cruel. But look at verse 6. When Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. You know, we can be so stubborn, can't we? We can be so arrogant. And we can make such a mess of things when we choose to go it alone and when we refuse to hear the voice of God. God knew that Sarai was barren, right? And Sarai knew that God knew she had no child. And yet she decided to go it alone. She could have cried out to the Lord as another mother will do. Another barren mother in 1 Samuel 1 and 2. When Hannah is barren, she does the biblical thing. She cries out to the Lord. And if you remember the name of Shamuel, this story is a hard story to go through. But it teaches us, at least this first part of the story, that when we move forward without God, we're not just hurting ourselves. When you make decisions without seeking God's guidance, we hurt those around us and we injure a lot of people because of our impatience. Long-term consequences come from short-term decisions. You know, I often wonder if Sarah and Abram's attempt isn't part of the reason that it takes another 13 years before they finally see Isaac born. Her decision to hasten God's hand, I wonder, my gut tells me that's one of the reasons that the delay of the promise is exacerbated so much. But not just the promise and the delay of the promise. Think about all of the problems that come because of this choice. Problems that they're still dealing with today there in the Middle East. If you don't know who this child will be and the nations that will be spawned out of this boy. And so that's the first part of the text. Rushing ahead and helping God out. Sarah's unwillingness to look up and to seek the voice of God, and her attempt to shortcut his promises, it's unfortunate. But you know, it's just the first half of the text. The second part of the passage is actually where everything starts to come together. You wrestle with, what's all this saying? Where are we going with this? Well, after Sarai accuses Abram, and after she disgraces her maid, she casts her out. I can imagine Hagar wandering in the desert, there in the wilderness, thinking that she's all alone, heading off into the desert, not a soul in the world to comfort her. But it's exciting when you read stories like this in the Bible, because someone had been watching over her all along. Someone saw her. Someone heard her in her distress and finds her. Look at verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Verse 8, and he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from? And where are you going? Listen to Hagar's response. I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. I understand as you read a verse like that, it's easy to being unloving here. I understand where that question comes from. But I think as you read through this text and as you look through the stories to follow, you're going to understand that this really was the best for Hagar, at this point at least. And I think God knew that for her and for the baby in her womb, this was the best course of action. And you have to remember that Hagar, even in this case, she's not completely innocent either, is she? I mean, think about it. Think about it. Hagar is being mistreated. And we understand that. But she played her own role in this. Don't forget how she despised her mistress. Remember that it was Hagar with her nose in the air, strutting around, right? She considered herself better than Sarai, didn't she? And so there's really no innocent party in this. And yet, when the Lord tells her to go back, what is he saying to her? The Lord says, go back to your mistress. Submit yourself to her. That doesn't mean she's to go back and to submit to being mistreated or to submit to some kind of torturous behavior. There's nothing in this text that says anything like that. The Lord is saying, go back and honor your mistress. Go back and Sarai. Go back and treat her with respect. Now, again, I think God knew this was the best thing for her and for her baby at this point. And before you misjudge the Lord's words here, listen to the promise he makes to her in the next verse, verse 10. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Shema in Deuteronomy, but the verse that is famously used by the Jewish people, hear, O Israel, Shema, hear, Ishma, and there's God at the end of it, El. God hears. Do you hear it? God is heard. And that name rings through the rest of Scripture as a reminder of this time, that the Lord has heard your affliction. You know, there are several times in Genesis, as you're reading, that you're going to find God making promises of descendants to very special people here. In fact, I found 6 times where God makes promises to Abram. Well, we can read through all of them, but you see time and again God making these promises. I'm going to give you so many descendants. He makes the promises to Jacob and to Isaac. Isaac in chapter 26, verse 4, and then to Jacob in 28, 3 and 4. God time and again is making these promises, but Hagar is the only woman to receive a promise like this in Genesis. And now her descendants are going to be included in Abraham's descendants, as numerous as the stars. And so by this, God is clearly honoring this woman very greatly. And I love Hagar's response as well to the Lord's promise. Because after getting such an incredible promise from God, instead of focusing on her new family, right, her new special role, instead of focusing on this new baby that God is going to give her, she instead focuses on God. And she gives 2 names here. She gives one name to God and another to the place. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well is called Bir Lahai Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. She named the Lord, you are a God who sees. You are a seeing God. And the well, Bir Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It's an incredible passage, isn't it? After this, Hagar, she obeys God, and she does what he says. She travels back through Kadesh Barnea to Beersheba, to Abraham's tents there in Mamre. And there she submits, just as the Lord tells her, to Sarai. And I want you to look at the last verse of Genesis 16 with me here. And I want you to pay attention to how the story reverses itself, if you will. In fact, let's read verse 1 again. Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. We come to the end of the chapter. So Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore. That's the second time we hear that. Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar, it's the third time we hear it, bore Ishmael to Abram. In the absence of Sarai's name is so striking there if you pay attention to it. And it's also very important to the message of the story. Because if you look closely, you'll find the text emphasizing that it was Hagar, time and again, who bore a son to Abram. No less than 3 times in these verses. Remember, Sarah's plan was that Hagar would bear a son for her. And this would be Sarah's heir. And yet the plan has very much backfired. And Abram and Sarai have to learn the hard way that cunning corners God never works. And when the Lord sends Hagar back, he sends her back with a message. And can you imagine how hard it must be? Because this message, this word from God is a baby boy, and his name is Ishmael. And every time they see the boy, they remember. They remember the lesson that clearly God taught to Abram. Because remember, it was Abram who named the child. And the only way that could have happened is either God directly or Hagar told this to him. And he learned the lesson so much so that he agreed and he named the boy God Hears, or God Sees. And I'm sure Abram and Sarah were humbled every time they saw him. And every time they said his name, God hears, Ishmael. And you know, Sarah and Hagar, they're not the only ones who learn this lesson in Genesis. In fact, they're not the only ones, I hope, that learn this lesson in life. But in Genesis 29, you find another young girl named Leah. And you'll find that God saw Leah as well, and he heard her. And he saw that she was unloved, and he gave her a child. You know, this message that I get from this text, it really is twofold, isn't it? There are 2 things to take away from this story. First, part that relates to Sarai, which is this: friends, shortcuts never work. None of us can bring about the fulfillment of God's promises. None of us. But God can fulfill his will. And when you and I abandon the life of faith, that road that God has prepared for us, and we try to go it alone, when we try to do things without God, what follows is almost always a chain reaction, right, of mistakes after mistakes. And the longer you and I stay off that pathway of faith, the harder it becomes to think back, and the harder it gets for us to discover, hey, where did this all get started? Where did I go wrong? And when we finally go back and you see where it all began, you discover there was a place in your life, this life of faith, some place in your life when you diverted, when you went off the path on your own, and you attempted to work things out in your own strength, in your own wisdom, in your own clever sort of an approach, trying to fix the problem, and at some point it backfired, didn't it? And now you have an Ishmael in your life. And every day you're reminded. Just like it backfires here. And it's going to backfire. Oh, is it going to backfire to Abram and his descendants big time? And what you and I need to do is admit that we've gone off the path. Just as Sarai and Abraham went off here. And turn back to the one who sees and the one who hears. The only one who can help. You know, while that's the first part of the passage, if you read through, I said that's not really the main message of this. Because this delayed promise, it goes on, true, but that's not the primary heartbeat of this story, at least not the way I see it. I think I'd be naive to think that there's not at least one Hagar sitting in this congregation this morning. Someone who maybe you're suffering because of someone else's hastiness, because of their pressure in your life. Maybe someone has taken advantage of you and their selfishness. Maybe they've hurt you. And maybe you're still struggling with those wounds even after all these years, bearing the weight of that pain. Maybe you're feeling alone or mistreated. Maybe it's something different. Maybe you've lost a loved one, a spouse, or a friend. Maybe you face some physical or emotional, or God forbid, even some kind of sexual abuse over the years. I don't know what the struggle is. Maybe someone in power, an authority figure, or a relative, God forbid, even a pastor, someone who hurt you, and you're still suffering. You know, some people, they turn to a bottle when they feel alone and broken. But aren't you thankful that we have something so much better than that? Because no matter what the affliction is in your life, and no matter how it came about, the truth is we have a God who sees, and a God who hears, and a God who meets victims who've been mistreated, victims in their distress. As Psalm 138:6 says, God sees the lowly. You know, that word for sees, it's not that God is looking at the lowly. To see someone, it's not just to look upon them. It's throughout the Bible, the word is often used for someone who is looking on someone, to care for them who's in their distress. And that's the kind of God that we serve. I want to do something a little differently this morning as we close. I want to read a lengthy passage. If you would turn with me to the book of Psalms. I had a few verses in mind, and the more I looked at the psalm, I just decided to, maybe I'll take a chance and read the whole thing. Psalm 139, if you will. If you're feeling alone and you think no one sees you, this is a psalm I turn to often. I'm going to read it. Just listen as I read. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Verse 4, for there is not a word in my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall upon me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hid from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they are all were written. The days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand of the sea. And if that doesn't make you fall out of your seat, then I don't know what will. When I awake, I am still with you. Skip down to verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties or my ways, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting. You know, if that psalm doesn't teach your heart anything, if it doesn't speak to you to say anything else, I hope you heard this, that God hears you in your affliction. He hears you every day of your life. He is listening. He sees us in our wilderness. Friend, don't ever give up on God. He's never given up on you. And always remember that we worship and serve a God who sees us.